Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sanzo podcast. Today, I'm sitting down and we are looking at the world through the eyes of Erica Blackburn. Erica is a spiritual healer and mentor. She founded the Invite Your Light method for spiritual evolution, which integrates timeless spiritual practices and perspectives to guide you inward and upward so that you can experience quantum leaps. I love that word, quantum leaps, and take practical action steps to discover your true nature, live authentically, and fulfill your life's purpose. Welcome, Erica.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I'm so excited for this conversation because Erica and I had a brief conversation prior to this, and it was so juicy. So I'm really excited for this episode.
I love having these conversations.
So you talk a lot about self-discovery, self-evolution. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey of evolving and stage development, and how I know I part of your bio said that you started at a very young age to instinctively just get downloads and just have spiritual gifts, I guess you can say. So if you could just give us a little sneak into what that looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like, things are always easier to understand in retrospect, or, the vision is 2020 in that case, when you're looking back at your life and you're able to make sense of things. And so it's like when I was living those moments of like feeling really connected to nature, really connected to God, even though I was a little child and didn't even really know what that meant.
Yeah.
Or I was like making vision boards before I even knew what a vision board was. Like I didn't know what I was doing, and yet it was just like naturally happening. But now in retrospect, I'm like, oh yeah, like the evolution and the discovery that was really happening was me like knowing who I was as a young child and like feeling that deep connection with source and with nature, even though I would maybe not have used those words as a kid. And then, kind of being out in the world and taking on more of what I thought I was supposed to be like and what I should be doing and how things were supposed to be. And then actually going back to my spiritual kind of path and spiritual roots and realizing, oh no, like self-discovery and self-evolution is knowing who you really are authentically and living that in the world. Kind of like no matter what, but at the same time, integrating everything that you've learned and everything that you know as you grow. And so for me, like I really liken it in terms of like development, I really liken it as to going through the chakras, right? I can really parallel it with like being at the root chakra and the survival and just trying to like fit in the world and like get my needs met, and then going through the sacral chakra and learning how to deal and work with my own emotions, because I had tended to be a very emotional person and I didn't quite know how to harness the energy of that. And then going through the sacral, this solar plexus chakra, and like learning how to harness my own inner power, and then working up through the higher chakras, which is more, about my own spiritual connection.
Was it weird at all, like going into, I guess, like high school and post-secondary, maybe even elementary school, and people weren't talking about the same things as you or interested by the same things as you?
Yeah, I think, what I think really helped me was creativity, because I was really drawn to writing when I was a kid, and I was really drawn to music when I was a kid, and even connecting to my body through like sports. And so for me, if I was able to connect with that, I saw that as like a very spiritual thing, even though again, as a kid, I would not have called it that. And so as long as I could find like people and groups that connected with those creativity elements, or those elements of like liking to move your body and like be in your body, I found that really helped. But as soon as I found myself not being able to engage in that, I was just like, oh, okay, something's not like connecting anymore. And like, maybe these are not my people, or this is not the place for me to be, if I couldn't find connection through like those things.
You had just did a post recently on Instagram. I really liked it because I know we've had this conversation before, and about in the sense of like, I just feel recently like spirituality has been kind of put into a box. And so I wanted to ask how you address questions, whether it's from just, people in your community or clients that ask you questions. And this was part of your post. If, they're being spiritual enough, maybe not spiritual enough, if they're being too spiritual. And, I feel like spirituality is just, people have just tried to put it exactly what I said in a box, and it's so much more than that. So how do you address that?
Yeah, well, I first, like to meet people where they are and just say like, oh, okay, I understand that is, that is a question that we have when our mind is trying to figure out things that go beyond the rational mind. like of course we want to fit in, of course we want to belong, like that is kind of part of our human nature and part of the fact that we are in relationship with each other, and yet I think that when we start to label things too much, it starts to contract this very nature of us that is so expansive. And like at the very same time, but how does the mind understand something if it doesn't get to label it and if it doesn't get to fit it somewhere, right? Like that's just the way that our minds try to make sense of life and try to make sense of like being safe in relationship to things that we maybe can't fully understand, but we could start to harness some of our other gifts, like our subtle senses, in order to like have a knowing of these things. And so I often just say to people like, well, let's talk about what doesn't feel like spiritual in your life, or what does feel spiritual. Let's just dig in a little bit deeper so that we can connect the dots, because always the dots can be connected. Sometimes it just takes like another perspective to help someone see that.
So would you say to the person that's going to listen to this and, they want to, for however they recognize spirituality as, they want to become more spiritual. So how would you kind of lead that path for them to live a more authentic spiritual being?
Yeah. Well, I think it first really starts with like, what does it feel like is in their heart, or what are they feeling drawn to? And then taking that seed and then starting to flush it out into, literally, we're all spirit by very nature, that we're like beings on this earth. Like we have this, and we are all energy. So this energy is the spirit. This is like our consciousness, our wholeness. We all have that, but then we each have a unique way that wants to be expressed through our own body and our own mind. And so it's like, again, if we can find that little seed for someone, and then we can kind of flush it out and expand it more, then that's them living their spirituality, their spiritual life, like in this human experience.
I love that. You talk a lot about intuition. I find with people, one, they're either like, they don't do the work to be able to hear it and be able to quiet their minds enough to hear it, or two, they hear it and they ignore it. I think especially for women, I would say more so. So how do you mentor your clients to be able to lean into their intuition?
Yeah.
And use it as a source?
I find that it's helpful to start with small things, because I know in my life experience as a child and as a teenager, I would get intuitive messages that seemed to be beyond what I could like comprehend, or like what would I even do with that piece of information, and it just kind of felt so big. So I think for many of us, because we all are intuitive spiritual beings at like the very deep core of us, I think that likely we've all had those experiences. We just kind of like put them aside, or someone else in our life told us like, oh, that's not a real thing, because they didn't know how to explain it. And so I find there tends to sometimes be like fear around it. And the way to kind of move through that fear is to just start with the small things, like noticing, oh, I have a thought about someone. I'm going to call them right away, or I'm going to reach out to them. And then they say to you, oh, I was going to call you, or I was just picking up the phone. And then you confirm to yourself, oh, that was okay. That intuitive nudge made sense and it worked out. So if we start with the small things and we practice them, then it's like a muscle that we're building at the gym, so to speak. Then we feel more confident when we're lifting bigger weights, or when we get those bigger intuitive nudges to actually follow through with them.
Isn't it the best when you're thinking about somebody and then they message you or they call you?
It's so beautiful, because it just shows us that we're so much more than this like physical time space reality, even though that's what seems the most real. It's just a little reminder that there's so much more that all of our physical senses maybe don't understand, or don't have the capacity to fully comprehend.
I know, just to circle back in terms of spirituality and putting it in a box, I know we've had this conversation before, but there's been this narrative, I think over the last few months, especially how, if you are spiritual or in the spiritual niche, what have you, that, then there's no need for you to believe in science, or to, have any type of belief in science. And I would love to like just integrate a little bit of the conversation that we had prior, in terms of you can be spiritual and, believe in science, and just really the parallel between spirituality and science, and where spirituality came from.
Absolutely. And I really see it as like, again, we are these like, like we are spirit in these human bodies. We are this consciousness in human bodies.
Yeah.
And science is being expressed through us as humans, and it's evolving as we evolve. Like science and technology evolves as humans evolve. And so I just see that as an expression, like science is another expression of the consciousness expanding in humanity. Now, maybe it hasn't fully evolved to the point that we can measure everything that is in the spiritual level at their higher vibrations of the world and what we can experience. But I mean, quantum physics has shown us that we can measure some things, and we're getting better at that. And I think the more that those of us who are in science are evolving, the more that we're going to be able to have ways to measure what we now call spirit and spirituality. Like it is part of the continuum of humans and how we grow.
So you can believe in science and still be spiritual.
I mean, I really feel like you can. I think that, again, if we think about the chakras or like stage development,
yeah,
science is really good at looking at the physical and using the physical senses to, prove something or have facts around something. And the subtle senses, which might be more related to spirituality, are our ability to do that not on the physical level, but on the higher energetic levels.
And I always bring him up. People must think I'm like, he pays me or something, but I always bring up Dr. Joseph Dispenza, who I'm like, I love his work. I'm obsessed with his work. He's in neuroscience. And like, he refers to the chakra system as energy centers, but it still represents the same thing and they do the same job. So that just in itself just shows the parallel of it.
Yeah. And I think about like ancient yogis or, in Chinese medicine, which I've studied, in ancient China, like they knew about all of these energy centers. Yeah. And yet thousands and thousands of years ago, they did not have the science to prove it or show it. And now we do. And now as a collective, like humanity, we're able to talk about the chakras and the meridians, and we're able to talk about the acupuncture points. Like we have more of a context to understand it, but thousands of years ago, they were still working with this energy.
You brought up Chinese medicine. Maybe take a couple of seconds to share with us the different modalities you work with and how you work with your clients, because I don't want to not talk about that. Because sure. Some of them are really, I think, they're all very like special, I think, but some are very distinct in the sense of, you know what I mean? I don't see many people practicing it. So
yes. Well, thank you for asking that, because honestly, to go back to your original question about my spiritual like evolution and my self-discovery, this has been part of it. I don't know if I speak for like everyone in this field, but I find that we tend to be drawn to this because we're doing our own inner work. Yeah. And then we might be so inspired that we just start to want to share this with other people. And so for me, like at the earliest age, it started with yoga. I started going to yoga when I was a teenager. And as I was in business school, I was always drawn to yoga and wanting to become a yoga teacher. And I didn't even know where that was coming from. Like I didn't have a way to even like no one that I knew was a yoga teacher. Do you know? Yeah. I was just like, I want to be a yoga teacher. I don't know where this is stemming from. And then it's the thing about spiritual evolution, I find, is that one thing kind of flows into another. And so yoga flowed into Reiki and Reiki attunements. And then that flowed into studying consciousness, like really deeply, and studying the mind, but from a consciousness perspective. And then that flowed into studying 5-element Chinese medicine. And then that flowed into studying spiral dynamics and no seed meditation. And so over, the last 10 to 12 years becoming certified in all of these elements, I'm now able to bring them all together to work with clients, whether that is one-on-one or in groups. But what I noticed is that you can't just like throw spirituality and energy work at people, right? You have to know where are they at on their path. Yeah. And then meet them where they're at, which is why I found over time it was helpful to have a range of like things that I've experienced and things that I could offer, so I could meet someone where they're at on their path and then help them on their own evolution to wherever they're feeling called to go.
Don't you love when a client comes to you and asks you for one thing and then you're like, oh no, this is what you really need?
Yeah, and I do, and I love that sense of open-mindedness because, you know, at my core, like the very first thing after, you know, being drawn to yoga, then I guess the next thing I was drawn to was coaching. And this idea of like helping people like really find the absolute like wholeness and best inside of themselves. And I was trying to figure out how to do that with people. Like, how do you do that? And that's kind of what kept the spiritual path growing, because ultimately, like we kind of have to go to those very depths of ourself to bring out like what is inside of us to be brought out. And so, yeah, I love when someone kind of approaches this work and they're like, I think I want this. And then through working with them, you can kind of help just guide them and steer that ship a little bit and give them context, because I feel like we all know this so deep down, but we might just not have the context or the language or the way to like put it into an understanding for our mind. And then once we get that, it feels so much safer and easier to explore it.
Yoga has been such a saving grace in my like mental health journey. Like, isn't it crazy to think like once upon a time it was like taboo?
You know, it's funny you say that, because I was chatting with a client last night about how we sometimes still call the spiritual world and spiritual work like woo.
Yeah.
I was really reflecting on that yesterday, because I was like, why do we do that? Like, what's that all about? And I was thinking to myself that it might have to do with like the part of us that still doesn't quite understand it or like know how to integrate it. So we just kind of label it woo. So if we say something that might seem a little off center, you know, people won't judge us. And yet I do feel eventually we're going to move through that and past that, and we won't even need to call it woo. It's not even weird. It's not out of the ordinary. It's literally just part of our ordinary experience, but it's really extraordinary because it's a part of ourself that again is beyond the mind. But as our mind becomes more whole and as we release fear and like judgments, again, just this all just gets to be part of the human experience.
And it's so out there now. You know what I mean? In the sense of, I think like every second person that I connect with on Instagram is like within this field in some perspective. So it's just like, even compared to like, I would say even like 5 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, it's just a whole different time now.
Well, and I think more and more of us are feeling drawn to work with this in ourselves and with each other, because I mean, there are billions of people on the planet, and for us all to kind of evolve together and us all to move out of the lower chakras to the upper chakras, it is going to take more of a collective effort. Yes. to do that. And I think it's important that we have those personal experiences of it as well, because a lot of this is beyond language. It's beyond things that can be explained, and it does have to be like felt and experienced.
So for anybody that's listening, that's, you know, toying with the going into this field, like regardless of how many like Reiki practitioners there are, or any kind of practitioners, like we need you as a collective to lift the whole vibration of the universe. So if you're being called to it, then act on it.
And each person has their own unique way of expressing it too, right? Like this is actually what I love so much about Reiki, especially because I think Reiki, as we both know and love Reiki, it opens up the chakras, it opens up the channels. And often when people start exploring Reiki, it's just like all Reiki, but eventually it starts to integrate, and then they use it as part of their unique expression and how they're meant to be showing up and serving in the world. So, I mean, that's why I love Reiki. Then we can self-heal and we can heal collectively as well. And I think it allows us to be more of who we really are.
The world needs it more than ever. You had said something I want to quote because I really loved it. It is commonly misunderstood that your personal work growth evolution can only take place during the difficult, challenging, and darker time periods in your life. And I love this because we focus so much on the struggle and, you know, the journey and turning pain into power. I think we sometimes forget how much growth there could be when everything's going okay.
Yes. And you know, you mentioned your mental health journey. Like I've also had a mental health journey. And one of my kind of sticking points was after I got through all the pain and after I got through all the things that I didn't quite know how to work through, it came up to joy. And it was like, oh, I'm having trouble actually like letting myself just be joyful and balanced, and peaceful and happy. What I've noticed working with clients is that when they do get to that stage, and some people are at that stage upon immediately meeting them, and some people we do need to work through some of the other stuff, so to speak.
Yeah.
But when we're in that really good feeling place, and we're in a place that that is joyful or does feel balanced, or we can look at things from, you know, all perspectives, well, again, that just allows us to help more of the collective. Then we can really be in what we're meant to be contributing in the world. We can still do our personal work, and yet it will have, I feel, a bigger impact on everyone, on the collective, on our family, on our community, because we're able to kind of lift our head a little bit out of our own experience, and we're able to allow it to be then more of a shared experience, a shared healing. And I do see that with clients who have done a lot of their own work, and now we're maybe working with other parts of their family or other parts of their community through them, though, because they still have a perspective on it.
I love that you said that, because I feel like the word healing has kind of like just kind of been not thrown around, but it's just used very generally in terms of like marketing and just like in content. So what is your definition of, one, healing, and two, transformation?
Yes. I think sometimes they can a little bit be one and the same, but let me kind of talk about them both and bring them together. I do think like authentically there is healing that sometimes needs to be done. Like, and I think that we each kind of feel that. Like, I know that when I was really struggling with anxiety, like in my heart, I was like, this is not me. Like, I don't know how to I don't know how to work with it more. Right. So I sought out so many healers and so many people to support that journey. That didn't mean that I didn't have the wholeness inside of me. That didn't mean that I didn't have my authentic self inside of me, but there was certainly some blocks or some interferences to me fully engaging with that part of me. And now that I've done so much of that work on myself, it is so much easier for me to just drop in and connect with like my heart of hearts, my authentic self, my true and original nature. So I think healing is less about fixing something, and it's more about removing the interferences or the distortions that are keeping us from like fully being one and the same with who we really are, and this like spark of consciousness within us. Now, transformation is like the changes that I think that we see or that we experience when we go through that healing path or that healing journey to be more of who we are. You know, people see that and they're like, wow, you're showing up differently. Like, you're responding differently. I think that's the transformation, which is maybe, you know, we feel it and we know it, but for us, it's so personal. It feels like a healing. And then for those of us in our life that support us and love us, like, they can see that as a transformation.
I love that you talk about how like your journey, like the catalyst of your journey was somewhat of your mental health journey and what have you. Because I find when people ask me how I got into this, I think they're expecting some kind of like fairy tale like answer, you know what I mean? Like, and I was like really in the sense of that's really the catalyst for me as well. So I love that.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, very early on, I was also really drawn to like business. Like, I studied business. I have a business background. I wasn't like seeking this path as a way to do my work in the world with others. And yet I had this like deep desire to support people to like be their very wholeness and be their very most authentic, because I wanted that for myself too. And somehow the paths just started merging. And I was like, no, they're supposed to be separate. And they just kept merging and merging and merging to the point that I was just like, you know what, stop fighting it, stop resisting it, just let it come together how it's supposed to come together. Which I just think is, you know, again, the universe may be working through me in the unique way it's supposed to be working through me. Even though my mind had other plans, you know, my heart didn't have those same plans.
And there's so much exterior, I use the word noise, but narrative, I guess, like in terms of like how businesses should look like and how things should like happen. So it's so easy to kind of fall trapped to that.
It really is. And especially when, well, and just to speak to my own journey, like when I wasn't as, you know, when I wasn't taking myself as seriously, when I wasn't taking myself with a capital S, like my true self as seriously, those other elements of culture and society were louder.
Yeah.
And now that, I mean, I've worked quite hard to cultivate my inner world. And now I can really confidently say, like, that voice is equally as loud or louder, or I know how to listen to it. I know how to tune into it. I know the cues. I know what I need to do to make sure that I give it protected space in my life.
Yeah, I love that. Because sometimes like, or like previously when I was like on Instagram, what have you, I'd see a post about, you know, how a program should be like formatted, or how, you know, calls should be formatted. I would kind of get stalled and kind of derailed by it. And now I'm like, okay, well, that's their perspective and that's not what I'm feeling called to next, kind of thing. So I love that point.
I always encourage like clients that I work with who are growing their own businesses in, you know, the wellness or healing realm. I always encourage them to take that inspiration, like, yeah, see what's out there. Like that can inspire you, but it doesn't have to be how you compare yourself or how you do what you do. It, you know, then I also just encourage them to go inward, to go into their intuition, to talk about like what it is that they really like and they're really interested in. And then we can bring it all together in their unique way.
Yeah.
Because I always think there's a special, unique way. I think best practices is a real thing, but then we each have our own spark of how that's supposed to be expressed through us. And that's why we can then, you know, speak to so many people and reach so many people and support this world evolution or this world consciousness, because we're all doing it through our own unique expression.
I love that. Is there anything that you're being called to share, download, I always say, in terms of with our audience, with our community, whoever's going to listen to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like I'm, you know, chatting with you now a second time, and I just feel really that the message is like of encouragement, right? Because everybody is on a different path and they are on a different place in their own journey or their own path, and it's just encouragement to like keep going, encouragement to know that like what you're seeking is literally, it's there with you, you know, it is literally there waiting for you to tap into it. And whether that's like next week or a year from now or 5 years from now, like timeline doesn't really matter. But I do feel like if you know, we're feeling called to something, or we feel something in our heart or in our bones or in our soul, like the encouragement to just keep going toward that, because that's where the brilliance is going to come out of you. And now that's not always like an easy journey. It's not always like a journey without messiness and ups and downs. But I always say to clients, like it is worth it. Like me being on the other side of that in many ways, it has been totally worth it, even though it hasn't always been the most pleasurable experience every step of the way. On the other side of it, it's like, oh yeah, that's been worth it.
And I love that messaging, the underlying messaging of your website and of your brand, really, how, you know, everything that you need is already inside you.
Yeah, because it totally is. And honestly, it's so much easier to work with ourselves and each other when we know that. And when what we really just need is someone to hold the space for us, to help us maybe see what we can't see, or help us step over what we can't quite step over. Like I often say to my clients, it's easy for me to see it for you. It's easy for me to hold that space and that confidence for you.
Yeah.
Because I'm not in your mind. I'm not in your head. I'm not in your fear or your limiting beliefs or your conditioned beliefs. So it is easier for me. And that's why people like you and I are doing the work that we do, because we so see that in people, all the possibility and all the potential, and it is in them. But we've all worked with someone along the way that has helped us to pull that out of us when maybe we were afraid, or we didn't feel like we had the full confidence to do so, or we didn't quite know even how to connect the dots. Like this, you know, I'm a space holder and a dot connector.
I love that. You're such a beautiful soul. I really can't wait for everyone to get to know you better. So let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is my name, ericablackburn.com, and as is my YouTube page. And then if you know, you're feeling more called to connect over Instagram or Facebook, it's erica.blackburn.energy.
Thank you so much, Erica. This is such a pleasure. I'm so glad that we actually finally sat down and had this conversation. I think it's such an important conversation for people to hear.
Yes, thank you so much for facilitating it. It was an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.